This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, welcome to episode 97 of A Geek Leader Podcast. And today on the show, I've got Jeff Tunn, and he has spent over 30 years in IT, including 10 years as a CIO. He's also the author of Amplify Your Value, Leading IT with Strategic Vision. And we had a great conversation. We talked about lots of cool stuff. We went back to the old days talking about Commodore 64s, into development, and how he got to start in technology and some of the key benefits for being a good leader and some of the practical things that you can do to improve value, to show value, and to have a seat at the table when it comes to making strategic decisions and being a leader, not just in IT, but in your company. I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode with Jeff Tunn. And if so, head over to iTunes, leave me a rating and review. Even if you're an Android user and you don't use Apple products, just go to iTunes, set up an account, leave a rating and review. That'd be awesome because that helps spread the word. It helps get more listeners to the show. Also, share it with your friend. Anybody that you know that you work with in IT, go ahead and say, hey, check out this episode or check out this podcast. Give it a listen. You might get some value out of it, and that would be greatly appreciated as well. Trying to get more listeners and trying to expand, so sharing it would be nice. Now give it up for Jeff Tunn.
Absolutely, John, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So I took a circuitous route to being in tech. When I was a kid, probably from the age of 12 to probably too old, the only thing I ever wanted to do was be a rock star. I was going to play guitar, and I was going to be world famous, and I was going to write songs. I actually went to university to study music theory and composition, and it was there that I learned you basically have to have talent. And I did not. So I was really, I describe it as being lost. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And it was the late 70s, early 80s, and this new computer came out. It was a Commodore 64, and it was, affordable and easy to use. And I bought one of those things almost on a hobby kind of thing. And I fell in love with it. I just fell in love with the ability to take this machine and give it a series of commands, and it would do what you asked it to do. And I taught myself how to program on it. And I just, to me, it was just an amazing ability to be able to create. So it was probably that creative juice from my rock and roll days. Now in creating software, and at the time I didn't really know what to do with it. I just knew I loved to do it. I read everything I could on how to program a Commodore 64. Started writing software. I think the first program that I actually wrote was a video game, a little computer game for my son to play to learn math, and it was based on the Dukes of Hazzard. And if you got the math equation right, the Duke boys would drive off in the General Lee and do their yoo-hoo kind of thing. And if you got it wrong, you had to keep trying. And that was my first introduction into programming. As a job, what I was doing at the time was working for a bank in Chicago. Believe it or not, in credit card collections, calling people up about their past due credit cards. And they started this project that was to revamp the software that we used. And I was chosen to be on that team. So I was the user liaison on this project. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is so great to be able to solve business problems with this computer programming stuff that I've been learning at home. And from that point on, I threw myself into every book I could find. Later moved away from Chicago to Indianapolis, and I was riding a bus about an hour a day each way to and from work at a bank here in Indianapolis. And I was reading about IMS databases, PL1 programming language, system development lifecycle, all these things, because that's what we used at the bank. And I finally got my big break. Was able to move from the credit card department into the information systems department as a remote data center manager. Sounds pretty impressive, right? What
Oh yeah.
that means is our programming department was actually in a building down the street from the bank, so it was remote. Their data center involved there was a printer there, and the programmers would print their green bar reports if you're old enough to remember green bar days. And my job was to rip them off that printer and run around the floor and hand them to all the programmers. So that was the remote data center manager.
So you were literally Sneakernet.
I was Sneakernet. Yeah, that's right. That's right. But it got me in with all these brilliant people. And I'd spend time studying the code of these programs that these folks were printing off and learning, and eventually got my real break, which was to be part of the software development team that was writing the credit card software for this bank. Anyway, that was kind of how I got into programming, and I was going to do that the rest of my life, man. It was just to be able to sit down and talk with someone about a business problem they were having and turn that into code and hand it to them and say, here, and have them say, man, that is exactly what I needed. Not what I asked for, but what I needed, because I was able to solve that problem through code, solve the business problem, and I just loved it. Um, Fast forward many years, and I was still that long-haired hippie COBOL programmer, harkening back to my rock and roll days, and I just wanted to write code. And I had a couple of friends that were really encouraging me. In fact, I call it kicking me in the butt, saying, "You need to go into management. You would be good at it." And I kept saying, "No, no, no, I don't want to play the politics. I just want to write code." Finally, I took the leap and went into management, and I found out that I loved that even more than writing code. To be able to work with a group of people and help them reach their potential was a bigger rush, a bigger satisfaction than solving the business problems through code. Right? It was, here's this team of people or a group of people first, and then you form this team, and then you work with them individually and help them grow, remove their roadblocks, and have them blossom. That was tremendous. So I've been on the management side of the equation for a number of years. So overall, spent about 35 years in corporate IT in various roles, 10 years of which as CIO for a couple of organizations here in central Indiana. And then about 4 years ago, I joke and say I moved to the dark side and I became a vendor. I joined a company here in Indianapolis called Blue Lock. We are experts, or were experts, at disaster recovery as a service. And I was the head of product. So my job was to look at our managed services, look down the future, and determine what problems companies were going to be trying to solve, make sure that we were building the products and the services to solve those problems for those clients. And I use past tense there because we were acquired by Intervision about a year ago. So we're now part of a much broader company, and my role has expanded. I'm now running the managed services product development group for all of Intervision. So we have managed services, not only disaster recovery as a service, but also managed on-prem IT services, as well as cloud services, security services, 24 by 7, NOC and SOC, those types of things. My job in essence hasn't changed, it's just gotten broader. So that's kind of my career in a nutshell. That's 37 years of being in IT.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit. Let me start out by saying Commodore 64. Yeah, that was my first machine too. I remember I was trying to get my dad to buy me one, and he made me cut grass to pay for it. But I was going through the classified ads, and I found a used one, and I ended up getting that as my first computer. And,
It amazes me, John, the number of people that I talk to that got their start on the Commodore 64. I wrote a blog series a couple years ago called The Path to CIO. And I interviewed 12 CIOs and talked to them about, okay, the premise was no child ever says, hey, when I grow up, I want to be a CIO, right? But how did we all get there? And I was amazed that of these dozen interviews that I did, the vast majority, their first computer was a Commodore 64. So it's tremendous.
Yeah, it was crazy. And my dad, he actually he worked in, I guess you would call it in IT back then. He was a computer operator,
Yeah.
and I thought that was like the coolest thing. And then now when I look back on it, his actual job was to take reels of tape off of a machine and box them and drive them to another location to store them. And that was
Yes.
literally his
Yep.
his whole job.
Yep.
But the Commodore 64 is pretty awesome, and I like you also kind of got into technology. I started out on the infrastructure side, and then moved into software by mistake. Kind of, I was doing DevOps before DevOps kind of existed, and got moved in there, and then got into management, sort of by mistake. It was one of those things where like, oh, you're really good at SharePoint and web development. We're going to make you the manager of the web development team. Oh, great. And then,
Yes.
right after you get started, like, oh, you can't do code anymore. Now you do people. And
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, what? But I fell in love with it too, because it's also like, it's almost like I don't want to say programming people, but you're helping find solutions for their lives. You're
Yes.
helping
Yes.
develop it, and like you were doing, creating solving problems for business needs. Now you're doing that for people, individuals, and it seemed to make a resonate more with me than writing code for 100,000 users that you don't know. It was more important to affect that individual that I do know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I used to tell my team when I was a CIO that my proudest day of my career would be when they come in my office and resign because they're going to go be CIO somewhere else. That means I've done my job. I've gotten them ready for that next step. And I think that's what management and leadership is all about.
No, I think you're 100% right. And, it's always sad to see someone go, but you don't get to that next level of leadership until, you've promoted someone into leadership.
Exactly. Exactly.
So what's it like? And this is a little off topic of leadership. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Being on one side, the coding side, to now being on the product side. And how does the things you take away from understanding, being a developer, being a leader of developers, to now being on the product side, and how does that work together?
I think it's a fabulous combination because I've been on the other side of the desk, right? I know the challenges that a CIO faces. I know the challenges that the VP of App Dev faces, or the VP of Infrastructure, because I've literally been in their shoes, and so you can bring that. Call it empathy, right? You can bring that empathy to the way that you look at products and services, and I try to do that every day. It's what problem are we trying to solve for that person on the other side of the desk? What are they trying to achieve, and how can we either A, take something off their plate so that they can go achieve whatever they're working on, or how can we directly influence them and help them achieve what they're trying to do? It's kind of like being, as we were talking a second ago about leadership and management, and your job is to develop your people and help them succeed. I'm bringing that same attitude to the way we look at products. My job one is to help our clients succeed. If we make revenue, this sounds crass in some ways, I guess. If we make revenue in the meantime, all the better. But my job is, how am I going to help my clients succeed? And that may sound a little bit cliche and a little bit disingenuous, but it's really kind of the approach that I take. And it's been fun to be on the other side of the desk, to having had that view. Because believe it or not, when you look across the tech sector, there's not a lot of folks from corporate IT that have made that jump. to the other side of the desk. And those that have bring this really unique perspective that those that grew up on the vendor side, so to speak, don't have. And I think that's an advantage.
I think you're 100% right. It's definitely an advantage, and I like to call that tactical empathy. That's that
Yeah, that's
you have
great.
that empathetic approach that you can, kind of point in the right direction and really solve a problem. And I agree with you. Also, profits are a byproduct, and I like to equate that to kind of working out. Um, you know, you're not building muscle; you're exercising, but the muscles are getting built because of the exercise. Just
Yeah,
like the
yeah,
profits are getting built because of the empathy, the work that goes into making sure you're solving the correct problem.
exactly.
And I think that's a great approach. Um, One of the things that really intrigued me about getting you on the show was to talk about how CIOs and IT leaders get that seat at the table, and how can they affect businesses and help solve those problems that we've been talking about. And I know I've seen it in certain areas where, the CIO does, even though he's got a C-level title, he doesn't really get to sit at the big boy table and make all the decisions when it comes to business, the way that a CFO would, or a CPO or CMO or any other C, levels
Yep.
do. Sometimes that CIO gets kind of lower down. And many times I've seen CIOs reporting to other C levels outside of the CEO, and not being that direct, connection, and kind of putting them down a little bit more. How is it that we can maybe get our voice heard a little bit more, and show the business that we do have value that we can bring when it comes to understanding our market and the things that we do?
I think that is a great question. It's something that we as IT leaders have been talking about since IT was created, right? Is how do you get that seat at the table? How do you get that voice? And I think the key, in my experience, is you got to stop talking about technology. It's not about technology; it's about the business. And too many times we spend so much time talking about this technology or that technology, and we start talking. We default to our acronym language of SDLC and SD-WAN and all these different acronyms that have no meaning to the person on the other side of the table.
Mm.
And so I think step one is to get involved in the business. One of the stories that I tell in the book that you mentioned, Amplify Your Value, is this concept that we were doing called ride-alongs. And so I was working for Goodwill here in Central Indiana, and as many of you know, Goodwill has retail locations all over the country. So we had about 50 retail locations here in Central Indiana. And I would take a day a month and get out from the data center, get out from behind my desk, and do a ride along with the VP of retail. And it enabled me to begin to see the stores through his eyes. What things does he look for? What things is he concerned about when he looks and does a drive around the store? What things are jumping out to him? And it really, not only do you get this focus time where you're spending an entire day with one of your biggest internal partners or internal customers, you get that view. We were talking about empathy earlier. It brings that empathetic view to his challenges. Then you kind of take it a step further. And the other thing we used to do is go work in one of the stores for a day. The executives were encouraged to do this on a periodic basis. And there's nothing as challenging as working the donation door on a Saturday afternoon, when people are done with their garage sales and are bringing all their stuff that didn't sell. And the line is 10, 15 cars deep. And that poor person that has to help unload the cars and then sort the stuff that gets donated, that gives you a whole different view. And what we were able to do then is design our systems to help them, to help speed that up. Another great example of this, going back even further, was I was working for a commercial real estate developer, and we were really excited because we were going to roll out Blackberries. Right, we were going to. This was huge, a huge step forward from flip phones or the Sprint push to talk walkie talkies that they used on construction sites. And so we're going to roll out these Blackberries. And so I actually went to a job site and was alongside the construction superintendent in his job trailer, and I'm handing him this BlackBerry, and he's a little apprehensive about this new technology. And then we start walking the job site, and we're standing on top of a building, believe it or not. Here I am, CIO, and I'm standing on top of a building that's under construction, wearing my hard hat, right? And he gets a call on his BlackBerry, and he can't read the screen because of the sun. And we're on top of this building, and there's no shade. So he's trying to hold his BlackBerry and block it with his body so he can read the screen. It's like, well, this is not going to work. And if I hadn't been there with him at that moment, I wouldn't know. So to me, that's the way you start to earn your seat at the table, is you get out in the business so that you're talking about the business challenges, and you're still thinking technology in the back of your mind, right? And you're thinking about how can you bring technology to help solve these problems that you're seeing, but you're really focused on the business challenges. And one of my favorite things is our KPIs, our key performance indicators. We're always looking at uptime. Oh, we've got 99.9% uptime, and our systems are always working, which is great, but your business doesn't care. Your business only cares that system is up and running when they need it. If that 1/10 of 1% of downtime comes on Black Friday and you're a retailer, it won't matter. You'll be looking for a new job. So you got to be looking at it in terms of what does the business need and how can I advance it. That begins to open up a whole new array of conversations across the executive suite. That begins to get you that seat. So to me, it's all about forget technology, get involved in the business as best you can.
Yeah, I actually had some experience doing things like that, and what we called them was field trips. We took field trips.
Yeah.
And we started this because I read it was an article someone had written about a guy named Doug Dietz who did this with MRI machines, and he went out and he was an engineer, and he created or designed this new MRI machine. Was super proud of it. It got put into a hospital as a trial, and he decided I'm going to go out and take a look at this MRI machine and see how it works. It just happened to be that the first two patients he was seeing come into it were pediatric patients. And they flipped out, they screamed, they thought this was the scariest looking thing in the world, and they both had to be sedated in order to go into the machine. And it just broke his heart. I created something that's terrifying these kids, and not only that, I look out the window and I see their parents, and their parents are terrified. So they went back to the drawing board. They took the exact same machine and kind of painted it, made it look like a pirate ship, and put some music in there that you could hear the music playing, so the kids were more at ease. And, just those little bit of changes made all the difference. But he would have never known that because the doctors weren't saying, we need this to look pretty. We need this to look like a fun thing for kids. And, but him going out there, he saw that. And not only did that, kind of transform his career and gave him a definite seat at the table when it came to medical devices, but it kind of launched him into this, world of creating usable products from an engineering standpoint.
Exactly. Well, and the big buzz around IT these days is digital transformation, digital disruption, and the biggest part of that is changing the way you interact with your customers, the way your company interacts with your customers. Well, how on earth are you going to design systems to do that if you don't know the customer experience to begin with? So you have to get out there and do that. I was on a podcast, hosting a podcast the other day with Jamie Lee. He's the CIO of Wabash National, and he talks about getting to know your customers' customers. So even taking it a step farther, and how are your products being used? How are your services being used by your customers' customers? So you've got to, that's probably the other side of this equation, right? Is to get into the business, but also get into the customers, and understand how they interact with your product or service.
I think that's a really good point. We used to do. So we took developers and we put them in the trucks with our field techs that would go out to people's houses and kind of do work when I worked for an ISP. And the insight, just the few little things that we would see how they did their job, and we could just say, oh, all we have to do is move this button over here, and it's going to save them 20 minutes a day. And it may not seem like a whole lot, but when you have hundreds of drivers and you're saving 20 minutes each driver,
it adds
it gets
up.
very significant. And also those people enjoy showing you what they're doing. They enjoy sharing, here's my part, of the business, and that you take a vested interest in that. It makes them feel more important. They begin to, think more of, IT and the tech department as being a partner, not necessarily just someone that we throw our problems to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're talking about how do you earn that seat. I think that that's one of the keys to be able to do that. It's learning to talk the language of the business. It's being out with the business, with the customer. I love that you were sending your developers out so that they can see and experience what the techs were experiencing. I don't know how you can design systems if you don't understand how they're being used.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What are some of the other challenges that you've seen that CIOs have, just as being a leader within their company?
Well, I think you hit on it before. Sometimes the reporting structure makes it really, really difficult. If even though you've got the C title, if you're reporting to another C-suite person like the CFO or the COO, no offense to them whatsoever, but if they're translating for you to the rest of the C-suite, things get lost in translation. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you have that reporting structure, I would encourage IT leaders to set up meetings with the other C-suite, talk to them directly without that translator in between. You get a better picture of the problems that they're facing and the challenges they're facing, and they get a better picture of you and what you're trying to say. So to me, it's building those relationships and getting out and doing that. The other side of this is you've got to be managing the table stakes, right? You've got to have stable systems. You've got to have efficient operations within your IT department. If you go into these executive offices and all they want to talk about was the fact that the internet was down yesterday, or that their PC was broken, or whatever the challenge du jour is that they were having with technology, you've lost the battle, right? So you've got to make sure that things are stable and efficient. Really, almost before you can have these valuable conversations, and that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, right? Is we got to have the table stakes before we go in and have these bigger conversations. So it's not all about the next new thing. It's you got to have your house in order first.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, because I've noticed that when I transitioned to a new company, and I first went around and met with all the VPs and C-level executives, and the first thing they wanted to talk about was, oh, my printer hasn't been working,
Yeah.
or we had this issue over here, and it was just constantly, I couldn't talk to them about what they do or what their needs are from our department. It was all about answering those questions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
once we got past that, after being here for about a year or so and cleaning up a lot of that stuff and getting past that, now it's more like, oh, here's the problem we're trying to solve when it comes to project management, or here's the problem that we're having communicating with our folks and making sure that we're efficient. Can you help us with that? And we've just launched a product, a digital transformation initiative, program that we're starting up. That's kind of, now we're getting to that phase. So I agree 100%. You've got to get those tech issues handled first before you can make these steps.
Yeah, and sometimes you may be doing a great job at that, and still the conversation. I can remember sitting down as a new CIO with an SVP, and I started the conversation about, well, how's IT doing for you? Oh, it's great. Whenever I have a problem, B comes and fixes my computer. It's great. It's like, oh, okay, so that's your impression of IT. So I kind of changed the subject, and I said, well, what about disaster recovery? What's the challenge that you would face if your IT systems all of a sudden weren't there? Oh, well, we've been building and designing buildings using pencil and paper for hundreds of years. We could probably go back and do that again. It's like, man, do I have a challenge of teaching and helping people understand the value that technology can provide in their business. So some of it is also teaching, and you probably can't do that directly. You have to do it through example and through experience. You can't come in and say, hey, I'm going to teach you about how cool technology is. That doesn't go over well. But it's this long-term process of showing them the value by solving problems that sometimes they may not even realize what the problem that they're having. They may be articulating a symptom. And if you can dig in and understand what the real problem is, then you can make a leap forward in building that relationship and building that credibility.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and I've seen that too. I think that whole thing is just saying, what are your thoughts on, disaster recovery or business continuity or something that's outside of, what they think of IT for, really does broaden their horizon and show, oh, okay, they're actually considering more than just fixing my printer.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing that I wanted to hit on a little bit when it comes to, amplifying your value, making sure your voice is being heard, and all those things. What are some of the day-to-day things that we can kind of remind ourselves to do or continue to do as leaders to ensure that we are, hitting those marks and communicating properly to our business peers?
I think there's so much. Let me break that down a little bit, and
Sure.
I think it boils down to communication, but it's two-way, right? You have to be able to communicate with your teams, and you have to be able to communicate externally. And as we were talking earlier, you've got to be managing your shop in an efficient manner. So I think it runs the gamut from I love to talk about having some core principles or some guiding principles. In fact, I dedicated a big section in the book to how do you create these principles by which you're going to run your IT department. For example, are you a build shop or a buy shop? The way that you approach things are going to be different if you're one or the other. If you're a build shop, you want to make sure that you're only building things that give you a differentiation in your business, and not building the next ERP system because you can buy those off the shelf. So you've got to have this set of guiding principles because you can't be involved in every conversation. And therefore, your team needs to understand if I'm faced with a decision, here's our guiding principle that helps me make that decision. And that's not to say they're hard and fast, but they set the day-to-day tone so that when you're in conflict with one of those, to raise that question to your management, to your CIO, and then your CIO can either make the decision or raise it to the governance committee. So a great example of that is if you are a build shop and you are an ERP shop versus a best of breed, if you're trying to solve a business issue, you're going to look first at the ERP and what modules it may have to solve that problem in its simplest form. If that module doesn't solve the business problem, you need to escalate something, right? It's got to be a discussion at the executive level that we're going to deviate from our core principle, and we're going to go buy a best of breed solution to solve that problem because it doesn't, the module that's available doesn't. And there's probably dozens and dozens of those types of things that if you take the time to define those in advance, your department can be running very, very efficiently while you're building the relationships at the executive level, having that communication, looking for ways to further the business through the lens of technology. It kind of frees you up to be able to do that. So I think those guiding principles are one of the core pieces. Another core piece that I think helps is I was sitting in this conference several years ago, and it was a panel discussion, and one of the panelists said something pretty provocative. He said, there's only two types of IT projects. There are AC and CF projects, and people were kind of confused by that. And he says, well, it's a grading scale. There are some projects that you're going to do. You're going to hit that grand slam home run. Hey, since it's NCAA time, you're going to hit that three-pointer at the buzzer to win the game. But the best grade your business colleagues are going to give you is a C. No one ever walks into the CIO's office and shakes her hand and says, thank you so much for delivering my email today. It's never going to happen. But if you fail at delivering email, the line is going to be out her office door with people ready to complain. And then the panelists looked at the audience of a bunch of us CIOs and said, why on earth would you ever want your team working on a C to F project? You want them working on the A to C projects, the projects that when you're successful, really transform your business. So we took that to heart and we started our portfolio management of all of our projects, and we started assigning letter grades to these projects. And if there was any project on the list that was a C, D, or F, we looked for a different way to deliver that. That might have been, hey, just stop doing it altogether because we don't need it anymore. Or it might be, gosh, if we took email and put it in the cloud, all of a sudden we don't have to manage on-premises servers delivering email ever again. We never have to do an upgrade ever again. So we're still delivering the service, but we're delivering it in a different way, and it's eliminating C to F work. And so we started looking at all our projects that way. And what we were able to do is free up time from our engineers and our technicians to spend more time in the business to understand the challenges that they were having. So it takes time. It's a roadmap, right? You're moving along this progression, but it helps you eliminate that C to F work, that keeping the lights on work, or at least reduce it, right? You're never probably going to get rid of it entirely, but it frees up your team from being able to do that. So I think those are two key components. One is your guiding principles, and one is the way you manage your portfolio and look at the services that you're providing to the client. I think, or to your end customer. I think the role of the CIO continues to evolve. It's probably evolved since day one, since the title was created. But it's more of you're managing an ecosystem now. You're managing an ecosystem of partners to help you provide those services. And So you have to look at those services to say which ones are value add differentiators for our businesses. I want to own those, and which ones are keeping the lights on functions. Let me find a different way to deliver those.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I wanted to ask you one more question, and I noticed when I was going through your bio and things like that, you had a talk that you've given before about Lewis and Clark, and I'm a fan of the Lewis and Clark story as a kid of how they traveled across America and were gone for 2 years, and most of the country thought that they were dead, and then they show back up and they have these great stories and these incredible documentation that they took along the way. What are some tips from leaders that you were able to gather from the Lewis and Clark expeditions?
Oh, that is, I love that question, and I was actually gonna in the intro talk about. I love the title of your podcast because I'm kind of a geek squared, right? I'm an IT guy that loves history, so it was fun to see the title of your podcast. So Lewis and Clark were these amazing individuals that came together, and there are so many lessons from the years that they spent on the trail. I'd say one of the biggest lessons was this concept of shared leadership. Right, these two people were co-captains, equal in every respect, and while that may not sound unusual, you have to keep in mind this was a military expedition, and to share a co-captaincy in the military was just unheard of. But what they knew, they kind of looked at each other, and I give more credit to Lewis in this respect because Thomas Jefferson asked Lewis to lead this expedition, and as he was thinking about his own skills and what he was able to do, his strengths and his weaknesses, he knew that he could not be successful without the complementary skills that Clark would bring to the table. So he invited Clark to join him as a co-captain because he was transparent with himself and he understood his strengths and weaknesses. And I think that is a vital lesson for leadership. You read all the time about in management books and leadership books that you should maximize your strengths and make your weaknesses irrelevant. And while I agree with that somewhat, you really have to understand your strengths and weaknesses. Just because you're not good at something today doesn't mean that that's truly a weakness. And I think Lewis was able to look at himself and know that detail work was not his strong suit. Clark was very detail oriented. Relationship and camaraderie with the men of an expedition was not his strong suit. Clark could build those relationships. So he brought Clark on board to kind of fill those weaknesses gaps that he knew he had. So I think to me that's one of the top lessons from the Lewis and Clark expedition. The other one that I think is really core to the core of discovery, to use that phrase, was the way that they made decisions. And if you study the expedition, they were faced with hundreds of decisions a day. Some of those decisions were life and death decisions. If they make the wrong move, they or their men are not going to survive, right? But they would use different approaches. They reached this point on the expedition that today we call decision point. And it was kind of this fork in the river, if you will. And if they chose the wrong fork, the expedition would be doomed to failure, if not death, depending on what happened. So it was vitally important that they chose the right fork. All of the men in the expedition thought the North Fork was the right way to go because it was heading off toward the mountains. The captains thought the South Fork was the right one to go. The right one to go. But they stopped, and for 3 days they explored the area and sent out the men on these little uh, expeditions to explore that particular fork or that particular fork, and they would come back and they would receive all the input from the men and they would analyze it together. At the end of the day, the captains were convinced that it was the South Fork, and they made the decision. But here was one of the key things: they explained to the men why.
Hmm.
Sometimes why is more important than what. Why do we think the South Fork is the right one? So they took the time to explain the decision. Not only had they taken the time to get the input, but they explained why. History tells us they were correct in their decision, but that was a turning point, I think. There's another example in the expedition where they were trying to decide whether they were going to winter camp on the north side of the Columbia or the south side of the Columbia. Again, a vitally important decision for the expedition. And that may not sound like much to those like me from Central Indiana. We have a river here, and who cares if it's on the north side or the south side of a 200-yard wide river? Well, the Columbia River at its mouth is, I forget how far across it is. It's like 2.5 miles across, right? And the weather was vastly different on the north side than the south side. There was so many different things that led into this, and they did something that was just unprecedented in a military expedition. They put it to vote, and every vote counted. And at the end of the day, the majority ruled. And I always love to point out that not only did every vote count, but they had Sacagawea with them, a woman, a Native American woman. She voted, and it counted. They had York, an African American Clark slave, unfortunately. He voted, and it counted, right? So they included everybody, and their vote counted, and the majority won. So two different styles of decision making. They don't share with us why they chose one versus the other at different points, but I think they realized that as leaders, we have to sometimes consensus doesn't work. And we have to know that we're faced with decision A or decision B, and we have to know how we're going to approach that decision. We still gather all the input, and we still make the decision, and we explain why. But sometimes consensus works, and sometimes you have to make the call. That's why we have the leadership titles, and they knew inherently which one to use at different points. So I think those were the transparency, that you look at yourself, and the way that you make decisions, I think were key to their success. And I could talk about Lewis and Clark for 100 years, but I won't. So
Yeah, I think that's a really good story, and I love the fact that everybody voted, and it's probably like the first time in American history anyway that an African American voted, and then a female voted, and they were fine, and it was
absolutely.
just an amazing story. And I agree. There's so many parallels to leadership when it comes to decision making, and the fact that they stopped and waited. Just a lot of things that we need to, we can take from that story into our lives as leaders. I think this has been really good. I would love it if you could give our audience one last piece of advice for becoming a geek leader, if you will.
I think what I would encourage everybody to do, and something that we didn't touch on today, but surround yourself with strong mentors, that can help you. One of the other things that I did that made a huge difference in my career was I hired an executive coach, because I think you need mentors and coaches to help you navigate through everyday challenges and long-term challenges. And I think those two things combined, along with a very, very strong professional network. I'm huge on LinkedIn, huge on Twitter, and I learned so much from those connections about how to handle different situations. So I would say that's my advice for helping yourself to grow as a leader, even if you've been a leader for a long time. Uh, a mentor, executive coach, and a strong professional network.
I think that's really good advice, and maybe we can have you back on in the future just to focus mostly on mentorship, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of leaders fall short in. And I know my mentor, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for mentor.
I'd love to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Any way that people can connect with you or find out more about Amplify Your Value?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, LinkedIn and Twitter. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn. Twitter, my handle is jtonindy. I'm on Facebook as well as jtonindy. My book, Amplify Your Value, is available on Amazon.com in both, in all paperback, Kindle, and audio. So whatever your poison is for digesting books, it's out there and available. And would love to connect with you and share insights.
All right. I'm going to link all those up in the show notes, and I appreciate it, man. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
I hope you guys enjoyed that show with Jeff Tunn. And if so, please head over to iTunes or Google Play or Spotify or wherever you listen to your music and share it with a friend. Leave a rating and a review if you can, and that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much.